Kia ora koutou. I'd like to start today's meeting by acknowledging Mother Earth and all her creatures, and to wish goodness to all people who know the earth to be sacred and who work to restore and regenerate our place. I'm Jo Kelly, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Toitū Tāhua. I'm pleased to open the Centre's first quarterly sustainable finance briefing, brought to you in partnership with EY. Last week, EY released their latest quarterly roundup of sustainable finance developments across the globe. The EY Oceania team has been preparing these updates for some time now, and the Centre has partnered with EY to bring their comprehensive newsletters to the broader group of financial market participants and stakeholders that engage with the Centre's channels. It's my pleasure to introduce Gina Morrissey, Senior Manager in the EY Climate Change and Sustainability Services team, who will be leading us through the presentation today. For today's briefing, Gina will provide an overview of recent global developments, then take a closer look at the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap and progress on the Australian taxonomy. I'll begin by providing some background on the outcomes of last week's Australia-New Zealand Climate and Finance Ministers 2+2 dialogue, which took place in Brisbane on Tuesday, the 30th of July, between Ministers Willis and Watts from New Zealand and Treasurer Chalmers and Minister Bowen from Australia. First, to explain the 2+2 format. A 2+2 ministerial dialogue is a specialised diplomatic meeting format that brings together two sets of ministers from two different countries. In this case, ministers specifically focused on climate change and finance. However, a 2+2 format may be more typically associated with defence and foreign affairs to enhance strategic and security cooperation between participating countries. In this case, ministers were climate and finance, and the purpose of the dialogue is to enhance cooperation and coordination between Australia and New Zealand at the intersection of climate, financial, and economic issues. 2023 was the inaugural 2+2, and this year's commitments built on and expanded the initial set last year. This year's official statement has 36 points, and these are summarised here. They include conducting a review into regulatory barriers to the net zero transformation, with an initial focus on regulatory interactions with standards for batteries and electric vehicle charging. Convening sector-based roundtables with the maritime sector to identify the conditions required for trans-Tasman green shipping corridors. Investigating the conditions for regional sustainable aviation fuel and exploring regional production of SAF. Inviting New Zealand aviation companies and representatives to join the Jet Zero Council. New Zealand joining Australia in the Climate Club to support industry decarbonisation across the Tasman and strengthen the Indo-Pacific's voice in this important forum. Collaborating on a guarantee of origin scheme for green hydrogen, sustainable fuels and green metals. Facilitating the alignment of sustainable finance taxonomy policy where appropriate, and discussing emerging sustainable finance priorities such as transition planning and investment product labelling, and further deepening collaboration, importantly, to deliver outcomes under the Paris Agreement and invest in long-term emissions reduction opportunities for the agricultural sector, including through enhanced measurement, engagement, and innovation. Today, we won't elaborate on the detail of the whole set of commitments, but I have provided here some additional detail on the sustainable finance sections of the agreement, which are grouped together under the heading in the agreement, aligning financial flows for an economically successful transition. Harmonisation between Australia and New Zealand's sustainable finance frameworks is particularly important given the integrated nature of our two economies and financial systems. Specifically, the 2+2 sustainable finance commitments and agreement text include supporting the development of best practice, interoperable sustainable finance frameworks that are aligned with international standards, prioritising Indo-Pacific collaboration to foster regional leadership and alignment of sustainable finance developments. Exploring opportunities to harmonise approaches to sustainable finance, starting with Australia and New Zealand's sustainable finance taxonomies. And for New Zealand, commencing taxonomy development in agriculture and forestry sectors, with the Centre for Sustainable Finance leading on development of New Zealand definitions, working closely with Australia's process, currently led by the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. Publishing a New Zealand Sustainable Finance Strategy in 2026 is the final commitment I wanted to highlight. And on those last 2 points, the Centre is very pleased to be included in the official text and to be working alongside the government on the development of the New Zealand taxonomy. We already work very closely with the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, or ASFI, and we are very well placed to ensure alignment and harmonisation to the full degree possible. We're also very pleased to see the New Zealand government's commitment to publish a sustainable finance strategy in 2026, following the publication of the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap earlier this year. These steps will help to provide cohesion and strategic clarity here at home, as well as position the trans-Tasman region as an attractive destination for green investment, ensuring both countries have access to cost-effective capital to support our industries and businesses to transition. Also of note for sustainable finance and for our stakeholders is that both governments recommitted to responding to the climate crisis in a true partnership with Indigenous communities that respects their deep and intrinsic connections with the environment. Both governments also acknowledged the critical contribution of Indigenous people's knowledge, sciences and practices in our collective climate response. The Centre for Sustainable Finance is strongly aligned with this view, as is ASFI, and we look forward to continuing to work alongside our colleagues from Māori organisations, as well as industry, academia and science as we proceed with the taxonomy project. In terms of what's next with respect to the taxonomy, we will have an establishment period where we need to look really closely at the Australian approach and look at the details of their technical approach, some learnings from their stakeholder engagement, and also the timings that are working to. We will also be looking closely at global developments, especially in the ASEAN region and China, which both have transition standards for agriculture underway. We're aiming to start technical development later in 2024 with consultation after the summer break early in 2025. And shortly we will publish on our website details for how to engage with that process. If you have any questions about any of the content in today's session, please write them down in the Q&A function and we will address them either via email after the session or during the session, time permitting. With that, I'm very pleased to welcome Gina. Over to you.
Kia ora, ko Gina Tokuingoa. I'm a Senior Manager in EY's Climate Change and Sustainability team based in Auckland. As Joe mentioned, EY produces a quarterly sustainable finance newsletter highlighting local and global sustainable finance updates. And I'll start today by giving a brief summary of the global updates included in our latest newsletter before talking you through Australia's Sustainable Finance Roadmap and taxonomy. So the first global update on your screen, ISSB has published the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy. It's consistent with the IFRS accounting taxonomy, so companies can provide a holistic digital financial reporting package to investors. The second update, TNFD and the European Financial Advisory Group have published a correspondence map to guide compliance with nature-related financial risk disclosures. The map supports comparability of TNFD's disclosure approach with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. The third update, the Network for Greening the Financial System, has published 3 reports on sustainability and responsible investment for central banks. The cover and 2 technical reports make sustainable and responsible investment recommendations, focusing on how central banks can integrate net zero considerations into investments in equity, corporate and sovereign bonds. The UN Principles for Responsible Investment released an introductory guide to biodiversity for asset owners, which explains the importance and relevance of biodiversity in the context of the investment process and outlines how asset owners may incorporate the issues into responsible investment policies, processes, stewardship practices, and disclosures. Number 5, the International Carbon Registry has launched a biodiversity program in Iceland to create a framework for issuing voluntary biodiversity credits. Number 6, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change has released a sovereign bonds and country pathways discussion paper. It advocates for the integration of sovereign bonds into net zero investment strategies for institutional investors. The UNEP established the Forum for Insurance Transition to Net Zero. The forum will support the acceleration and scaling up of voluntary climate action by the insurance industry. The IEA research has suggested that clean energy accounted for 10% of global GDP growth in 2023, and that amounts to USD 320 billion. Number 9, the Green Finance Institute analysis has quantified the impact that nature degradation could have on the UK's economy, and has quantified that at a 12% reduction to UK GDP. The analysis shows that nature-related risks are as detrimental to the economy as climate risks. Number 10, the United States Department of Energy announced US $500 million for CO2 transportation infrastructure to accommodate the rapid growth of the carbon capture and storage industry. So lots in there, lots of development in the nature and biodiversity space, which I think will continue as we better understand the global economy's reliance on nature and the work and investment required to protect and conserve it. So over to the next slide. Awesome, thank you. As Joe mentioned, one of the announcements made as part of the 2+2 discussion last week is the New Zealand government's intention to develop a sustainable finance strategy. Australia provides an example for how New Zealand might want to develop this, and is especially relevant given New Zealand and Australia want to coordinate approaches to sustainable finance. So I want to point out that Australia is not the only example. The UK, Singapore, and other jurisdictions also have sustainable finance strategies, each with their own flavour. So in November 2023, the Australian government released its sustainable finance strategy, which has 3 overarching objectives: to mobilise the significant private sector investment required to achieve net zero and support Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. Secondly, to ensure Australian entities can access capital and pursue business opportunities that support the transition and are aligned with positive sustainability outcomes. And thirdly, to ensure climate and sustainability related opportunities and risks are well understood and managed at the entity and systemic level. So the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, you can see the 3 pillars on your screen at the moment, was released on June 19th, 2024, and sets out the Australian government's vision for the implementation, enablement of the sustainable finance strategy through key sustainable finance reforms and related measures. The roadmap includes the 3 pillars on your screen, and 10 priorities to deliver on the strategy objectives. I'm going to talk you through the pillars and the priority actions. We'll go to the next slide and talk you through pillar 1. Awesome. So pillar 1 is to improve transparency on climate and sustainability. The first priority is to implement climate-related financial disclosures. The standards have been developed by the AASB based on ISSB S2. These standards are known as the ASRS, which I'm sure most of you have heard of already, also known as the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. There's the intention for other sustainability related reporting standards to follow the climate reporting standard. The standards will require large businesses and financial institutions, as well as entities above the publication threshold of the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, or the NGES scheme, to disclose. The standards are to be finalised in August 2024, and requirements are to commence 1st of January 2025, so a full year after the New Zealand climate standards have come into force. The second priority is to develop the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. More on the taxonomy later, so I'll skip to the third priority, which is supporting credible net zero transition planning. Treasury is developing guidance on best practice transition plan disclosures. Transition plan disclosures will be required through the climate disclosure regime. These will be published by the end of 2025. Again, New Zealand is ahead of Australia here, with transition plan disclosures required under NZCS, and the XRB is currently developing a working draft transition planning guidance for feedback. Our understanding is that this will be published in Q3 of 2024. Pillar 4, developing sustainable investment product labels. The Australian government has committed to establishing consistent labels and disclosure requirements for sustainable investment products, and Treasury is currently developing these. Public consultation on these requirements will begin in early 2025, with a target of 2027 for regime commencement. We go to Pillar 2. The Pillar 2 is financial system capabilities. The first priority action under this pillar, priority 5, is enhancing market supervision and enforcement. ASIC is currently undertaking targeted surveillance and overseeing sustainability-related disclosure and governance practices across its regulated entities to reduce harms from greenwashing and other sustainable finance-related misconduct. This is as part of its strategic focus on sustainable finance for the period 2023 to 2027. The FMA is performing a similar role in New Zealand with respect to the New Zealand climate standards. Priority 6, identifying and responding to systemic financial risks. The Council of Financial Regulators, or CFR, through its climate working group, is currently deepening risk management capabilities and practices in relation to climate and sustainability related financial risks across financial regulators and market participants. APRA is continuing work on climate vulnerability assessments, with the banking sector climate vulnerability assessment already complete and the insurance climate vulnerability assessment currently underway, with findings expected to be published by mid-2025. Priority 7, addressing data and analytical challenges. Again, the CFR is developing recommendations to address key sustainability-related data challenges faced by financial system participants, focusing on accessibility of data, estimation and use of Scope 3 emissions, data used for climate risk assessments, and nature-related data. The recommendations are to be made to government in early 2025. Priority 8, ensuring fit-for-purpose regulatory frameworks. ASIC and APRA have strong expectations around disclosing and managing financial risks associated with climate change within their existing mandates. Stakeholder feedback in November 2023 generally agreed that the financial regulatory frameworks are fit for purpose. However, some stakeholders identified concerns with the annual superannuation performance test, suggesting that the current design of the test is a barrier to integrating climate and other sustainability considerations in superannuation investment decision-making. As a result, the government published a consultation paper in March 2024 to seek feedback on options to redesign the test. The government will continue to work with financial regulators governance experts, and industry stakeholders to identify policy priorities for mainstreaming sustainability considerations in corporate governance, and financial institution decision-making. So we go to the next slide. Thank you. Pillar 3, Australian government leadership and engagement. We have 2 priority actions under this pillar. The first is issuing Australian sovereign green bonds. The first green bond was issued on the 4th of June 2024 in alignment with the Green Bond Framework, which was published in December 2023. The government will publish annual allocation and impact reporting commencing in 2025 and will be supported by Treasury. In comparison, New Zealand has had a green bond framework since September 2022, and the first green bond was issued in November 2022 of 3 billion NZD, and the current total is 4.2 billion with a maturity date of 15th of May 2034. The last priority within the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap is stepping up Australia's international engagement. The Australian government has committed to stepping up international engagement on sustainable finance to promote the development of consistent global standards and high-quality interoperable frameworks. And this international engagement includes the Australia-New Zealand 2+2 climate and finance dialogue that Joe mentioned previously. Great. So now talk through the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Framework, and then if time allows, the governance structure in place to support its development. As an introduction, the Australian Taxonomy Development Project commenced in July 2023. It is a joint industry government initiative led by the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, or ASFI, in partnership with the Commonwealth Treasury. The taxonomy will initially be voluntary, but will be reviewed by the government to explore how it could be incorporated into regulation. The initial development phase is currently underway, and will conclude in December 2024. It covers the development of climate change mitigation criteria for 6 priority sectors, development of a do no significant harm framework and minimum social safeguards, and associated technical work related to taxonomy implementation, including proposed longer-term institutional arrangements, taxonomy use cases, data requirements, and interoperability considerations. The draft headline ambitions and climate change mitigation criteria for the first 3 priority sectors are currently being publicly consulted upon. Awesome. So on the page, we have the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Framework. The taxonomy is informed by principles, objectives, and ambitions. On the right in the yellow rectangle, we have the 4 principles: credibility, that's a methodology sound, activities and criteria appropriate. Usability, is the taxonomy easy to use and understand? Interoperability, is the taxonomy consistent with Australian accounting taxonomies and other jurisdictions' sustainable finance taxonomies? And then prioritization for impact. So Australia is starting with the most impactful sectors as an example. At the top, back a slide. Thank you. At the top of the flow diagram, you can see objectives and headline ambitions. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 environmental objectives within the taxonomy: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation and resilience, biodiversity and ecosystem protection, sustainable use and protection of water resources, pollution prevention and control, transition to a circular economy. And for each of those environmental objectives, there will be headline ambitions, which reflect either an Australian policy outcome or an international commitment. And these headline ambitions are currently out for consultation. But if I was to give an example of what a headline ambition might be for the climate change mitigation objective, it could be, for example, for Australia to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Go to the next slide. Great. So sitting under the environmental objectives, we have scope and coverage. So the taxonomy has a defined scope and coverage. It outlines what sectors are covered and what activities are eligible. 6 priority sectors have been identified in the initial development phase, and more may be identified in the future, but for now we have electricity generation and supply, minerals, mining and metals, construction and the built environment, manufacturing and industry, transport, and agriculture and land. Activities must align with the green or transition methodology to be regarded an eligible activity through the taxonomy. So you can see the image on the lower right. The transition category's purpose is to put in place a mechanism to cover transition activities and encourage movement over time. The method has been consulted upon and endorsed. And transition activities are defined as economic activities and assets that, based on current technology readiness levels, have a continued role or uses in a net zero post-2050 economy, do not have low carbon emissions alternatives, can be decarbonized across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, even if decarbonization is only economically feasible in the long term, and the risk of locking in future high carbon assets can be mitigated. Just wanted to point out that it's important to have this category to mobilize capital toward initiatives that facilitate the decarbonisation of hard to abate sectors, because decarbonising these sectors will play a crucial role in reducing emissions, and the taxonomy will support in progressively steering economic activities towards Paris-aligned emissions. The taxonomy will also assist in mitigating the risk of greenwashing, and that's by not including these activities in one category, being transparent that there are both transition activities and green activities that are captured under the taxonomy. Also a note that gas has not been included as a transition activity, despite the Australian Future Gas Strategy backing gas as an energy source beyond 2050 to assist the rollout of renewables. Green activities have been defined as economic activities and assets that are consistent with achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the Paris Agreement temperature goals. Great. So eligible activities must then go through activity qualification, which requires technical screening and that do no significant harm, and minimum social safeguard criteria are met. Technical screening criteria defines the specific substantive performance requirements, thresholds, and or other metrics which the activity must meet to be classified as green or transition. There will be technical screening criteria for each activity. The draft climate change mitigation criteria for the first 3 priority sectors under development are out for consultation. So those sectors are electricity generation and supply, minerals, mining and metals, and construction and the built environment. As an example of technical screening criteria for an activity within the electricity generation and supply sector, geothermal energy generation is shown on your screen. In order for the activity to be deemed green, geothermal energy generation to support fossil fuel infrastructure are not eligible, and the emissions intensity over the life cycle of the power plant must be less than 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. As mentioned previously, do no significant harm and minimum social safeguards criteria must also be met for any activity to qualify. The do no significant harm principle ensures that an activity that contributes to one taxonomy objective does no significant harm to any of the other objectives. The Australian taxonomy will include generic and specific do no significant harm criteria. Generic are defined for each taxonomy objective and apply to all the activities, and specific are defined at an activity level for each objective. So that would be, for example, for the geothermal energy generation activity, there would be a specific do no significant harm criteria for the climate mitigation objective. And then again, specific do no significant harm criteria for the other objectives. Minimum social safeguards ensure that companies engaging in taxonomy aligned activities adhere to a set of defined social standards and guidelines, including in relation to corporate governance, human and labour rights, and First Nations peoples and cultural heritage. They will be informed by the draft social objectives and core pillars. You can see a screenshot on your screen. It might be a bit small to read, but there are 3 social objectives. The first one, elements of corporate governance, which covers things like fair competition, community engagement, and procurement practices. The second objective, human rights, covers things like occupational health and safety, modern slavery, and gender equality. And then the third social objective is self-explanatory, Indigenous peoples and cultural heritage. Great, so that was an overview of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Framework. I'll now briefly talk to the governance structure that is supporting the development of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. You can see the flow diagram on your screen. It's a government industry partnership that's led by ASFI. So that's a center navy blue box on your screen. The Climate Bonds Initiative provides technical input and support. That's the bright blue box to the right. As do the sector and subject specific advisory groups. So that's the teal box bottom left, and the taxonomy technical expert group, which is the green box middle left, which is independently chaired and has been appointed by public expressions of interest. So the taxonomy technical expert group, or TTEG, is co-chaired by Guy Debelle, who's the former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and also the former chair of the Australian Council of Financial Regulators Climate Working Group, and Emma Hurd of EY, who leads EY's Net Zero Centre and is a partner in the Climate Change and Sustainability team based in Sydney. She has deep expertise in developing, implementing, and assessing sustainable finance taxonomies, and led the taxonomy technical team that worked with ASFI on the initial design considerations and transition methodology for the Australian taxonomy. The TTIG provides strategic direction over input into and endorsement of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy for consideration by government. The TTIG collectively represents a mix of skills and experience that are critical to informing the taxonomy's development, including in sustainable finance, whole of economy, decarbonisation, climate and environmental science and policy, human rights and Indigenous rights and perspectives. The Australian Council of Financial Regulators Climate Working Group, so that's the top left yellow box, provides oversight and feedback. And it's all underpinned by comprehensive stakeholder engagement through a formal public consultation process, as outlined in the teal box bottom right. Great. So I will hand back to Jo to close, but thank you for the opportunity to present today. Hopefully you found that part of the session interesting and or informative. And as Jo mentioned, the Centre and or EY will aim to respond to the questions you've put through. Might be a brief chance after this or via email after today's session. So I'll hand back to Jo. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, for your presentation, and thanks for everyone who is in attendance today. We are aware that getting under the hood on the taxonomy is truly for those interested in the detail, but they are important details because this helps to define how we mobilise and direct capital into our key transition sectors. So worth spending a little bit of time with the mechanics. We won't be sending out today's slides, but you can find more detail about the Australian roadmap on the Australian Treasury website, and also details on the Australian Taxonomy Project at asfi.org.au. That's asfi.org.au. You can also find the recommendations for the New Zealand taxonomy at sustainablefinance.nz. That's the Centre's website. And again, those were recommendations put forward to the Minister for Climate Change by an independent technical advisory group convened by the Centre with technical support from Climate Bonds Initiative. For those interested in finding out more about financial product labelling in Australia, you may like to look up our June drop-in session with RIA, where they outlined their position on this and key considerations for a government-led regime. We will be following up with a recording of today's session via email to all attendees, and this will include links to subscribe to future briefings, and we hope we'll share those links with people in your networks who you think may benefit from our briefings. So that's it for today. Thank you all again for your time, and ka kite anō. Kia ora.